In September 2019, 130 global banks gathered at the United Nations General Assembly in New York to launch the UN Principles for Responsible Banking. The principles provide a framework for banks to embed sustainable, responsible banking in general, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals in particular, into their strategies, operations and activities. We were there at the launch too, as the Chartered Banker Institute was one of the first independent organisations in the world to endorse the principles. Now, whilst those principles themselves may be new, the values and the approach to sustainable, socially purposeful banking they're built on is not. Since 1875, our institute, the oldest institute of bankers in the world, has led the way in codifying, developing and embedding values of stewardship, prudence and customer-focused ethical professionalism in banking. Responsible banking, in fact, as we'll now call it. A decade ago, the global financial crisis demonstrated by their absence in some parts of our sector just how important these values are if, as a banking and finance profession, we are to rediscover our sense of social purpose and reconnect finance with the customers, communities and societies we serve. One of the ways we can best do this, in my view, is for the banking profession to support the transition to a sustainable, low-carbon world by putting sustainability and stewardship of people and planet at the heart of finance. The Paris Agreement on climate change requires countries to make flows of finance consistent with low greenhouse gas emissions and climate-resilient development. And I think it's very telling that the key global climate change agreement has, in one of its three main objectives, singled out the critical role of finance. The transition to a sustainable low-carbon world requires very substantial capital, and the scale of investment required means that public funds alone will not be sufficient. Our sector, our banking and finance profession, therefore, has a key role to play in mobilising and directing private capital to support the transition. It's estimated that up to 80% of the funds required will need to come from private sources. And it is banks, investment funds and other financial institutions that, by doing what we can do best, will connect private capital and savings with the investments and projects needed for that transition to a sustainable, low-carbon world. We must align our strategies, operations and activities with the Paris goals, and the new principles for responsible banking help us to do just that. But when we talk about responsible banking and sustainable finance, however, there's a much wider aspect to this beyond tackling climate change, which in my view is equally as important. And that is ensuring that banking and finance support customers, communities and society as a whole through responsible, inclusive, patient and socially purposeful finance. Responsible lending, financial inclusion, serving all customers to the best of our abilities and always putting their needs first. These are all aspects of a responsible, sustainable approach to banking consistent with the principles for responsible banking. The principles themselves provide a framework for positive change in banking and finance, but change is led ultimately by individuals leading their colleagues and leading their organisations. The change we seek in mainstreaming responsible, sustainable finance in general and the principles for responsible banking in particular must be led by increasing numbers of committed banking and finance professionals. Professionals with an understanding of the critical role of financial services in supporting the transition to a low-carbon world. Professionals who understand how socially purposeful, customer-focused banking creates value for society as well as for shareholders. Professionals with the knowledge and skills to be able to develop and deploy strategies, products, services and tools in their institutions that will embed the principles for responsible banking. Helping banks and bankers develop that knowledge and skill is what we do best here at the Chartered Banker Institute. It's why we are extremely proud to be the first educational body in the world to incorporate the UN Principles for Responsible Banking into our qualifications, initially via our Foundation Professional Banker Certificate and Benchmark Green Finance Certificate. Endorsing, promoting, educating and encouraging the adoption and embedding of the principles for responsible banking across the banking sector is something that we, as a professional body, are fully behind. The principles will not only help embed sustainability within our sector, but will help demonstrate a positive social purpose for financial services, help reconnect banks and society, and contribute to the process of rebuilding trust in the financial sector overall.